Okay, so according to my clock, it's the top of the hour when we were meant to be starting this session. So I'd like to welcome you all to this spotlight with myself, Christina Silva. Lovely to see many names that I recognise in the list of people here today, but also lots of people who maybe don't know me very much well. So you can see my contact details there. Please do get in touch. Always interested to hear how people are using MAXQDA and happy to field any follow-up questions if there are any. Also, just wanted to quickly point you to a few open registration workshops I've got coming up on different aspects of using MAXQDA out there at the top right, if any of you are interested in that. But let's get on to the main aim for this session, which is to discuss what are summaries in MAXQDA and how can they be used. I want to start off just by making a couple of points about summaries in the context of other writing spaces in MAXQDA. And summaries are actually one of several writing spaces, and it's useful in thinking about how you might use summaries to understand how they differ from other writing spaces. So in addition to summaries, we have paraphrases, and there is a spotlight on paraphrases as well, I'm sure. And paraphrases is all about annotating qualitative segments of data with little analytic notes. So sort of comments about specific segments in the data, and those paraphrases can then be categorized using codes. So that space is a very specific space, and often paraphrasing is an initial analytic task in a project, maybe a pre-coding exercise to inform the development of codes in an inductive process, for example. So that's one space you have. Similar to paraphrases, but a little bit different, are comments. They're different in the sense that they're attached to coded segments. So you code first and then you comment, rather than paraphrasing. You paraphrase first and then you code from there. So comments are therefore often used at a slightly later stage than paraphrases in my experience, although it's worth knowing that when you categorize paraphrases, they turn into comments. So there is a relationship between paraphrases and comments. You may also be aware that we've also got memos in MAXQDA, and they're larger writing spaces. So if a paraphrase and a comment is an analytic note you make about a particular piece of data, a memo is a larger space. You can link memos to various other components in your MAXQDA project, including codes, documents, and at various positions in a document, but they're a bigger space to write and they don't have to be linked to something else, whereas paraphrases and comments are linked to segments of data. Summaries, however, which is what we're here to discuss today, they're similar to comments in some ways, in the sense that they're linked to coded segments. But the real difference between summaries and comments is that when you're working with summaries, you're really abstracting away from the data in some sense, and you're able to view the coded segments together in a tabular or grid display. So comments, you're really embedded in the data always, whereas with summaries, you're abstracting away from the data and you're looking at those coded segments in a grid. And I'll show that to you later on. And so therefore, you're conceptualizing your coded segments together rather than individually, as would be the case in comments. And hopefully that will become clear when I show it to you in a moment. So in that sense, when we're working with summaries, we're comparing, we're reducing, and we're displaying and analysing in that comparative way. And hopefully you'll see through this presentation today and in your thinking and experimenting with these tools that you can use summaries for a whole range of different analytic purposes. And I'm a real fan of thinking about, okay, not just, oh, what's the tool, how could I use it, but always forefronting the analytic task that you have and making that the driver for the use of the tool. Okay, so let's have a little bit of an overview about the functions in MAXQDA related to summaries. And there are several. So first of all, there are summary grids, and I'll show you those. That's the means, the initial means by which we are enabled to summarize coded segments in that grid or tabular display. Then once we've generated our summaries, we can view those in a table themselves. So that's one level of abstraction further away. And we can do that on their own or together with variables. You may be aware that variables are factual characteristics that you can apply to different units of analysis in your MAXQDA project. And if those variables are associated with documents, with data files, then you can view those variables in your summary tables as well. So we'll have a look at that too. And then we have the Summary Explorer, which again allows us another layer or level of abstraction, if you like, whereby we can compare our summaries, not in relation to documents, but also in relation to cases or groups of documents. So we'll look at that as well. So hopefully you can see how that's a further abstraction. In addition to that, we also have the ability in MAXQDA to generate overviews of our summaries at various levels in our coding scheme, our coding system, and our document system. I will show that to you also. So that's a little bit of an overview. So I'm just going to flick into demo mode. And today for this little demonstration, I'm using the sample project, the English work-life balance example project that comes with every installation of MAXQDA, so that you can experiment with something similar in your own time. And what I want to do first of all is just to show you where to access the summaries together. And they're in the analysis main menu up here. And you can see we have buttons here for the summary grid, the summary tables, and the summary explorer. And the overviews are accessible by right-clicking at various positions or levels within the document system. So here I'm right-clicking on a document group, but I can also access the overviews by right-clicking on a document itself, or indeed also by right-clicking in different levels within the code system. So we'll have a look at that later on. So although the three main features or functions for summaries are accessible through the analysis main menu up here, and I'll show you them one at a time, it's also important to realize that you can access those overviews within the document and code system. Okay, so let's have a look at the summary grids. Okay, so when you hover your cursor over that button in your analysis main menu, the MAXQDA reminds you in this little pop-up that the summary grid is all about summarizing your coded segments in your documents in your own words. So you have to have done some coding for this to be something that's relevant to do. In this project, lots of coding has been done. So when I open up the summary grid, initially I'm presented with this floating window that I can resize and move around the place. And it's basically got two parts to it. On the left side here, I've got every single code in the coding system at the moment down the left-hand side. So that's a replication of my main code system in the main interface in the background. And I've also got a column for every single document that is in my current project, regardless of whichever document groups they may be in. So every single document that's stored in the document system is given a column here. So I'm looking at every code by every document, basically. There's various things that I can do to understand or change the display here. First of all, you can see that I can see the column names here as short names. If you want to reduce the size, the width of the columns, you can ask for shorter columns. Column headers, that gives you a quicker overview, but you lose the names, and you can have the full names as well. You can also change from circles to squares, depending on whether you prefer circles or squares. I quite like circles, but more usefully, I think, is that you can display the nodes as values. So here what we're seeing is that in the intersection between the childcare code and the document, this document here, Thanth, there are 4 coded segments. And if I click on those coded segments, then on the right-hand side of this summary grid panel, I get to see those 4 coded segments one by one. Okay. I can ask to see various things along with this information. So at the moment, I've got the display comments icon selected. I know it's selected because it's slightly dark grey in the background. And that means that any coded segment that has also already had a comment applied to it, that comment will be displayed. If I toggle that off, then that comment disappears. So that's what's going on there. And I can get something similar with memos as well. I think if I go here, then you can see here's a memo associated with that coded segment, and I can choose to hide or reveal that memo. I can also access any memos that have been associated with coded segments just by clicking on there, and it brings up that memo, and that's fully editable. I can carry on writing if I want to. So one of the features or the characteristics of MAXQDA more generally is the interconnectivity between everything. Okay, and you can see that here where something else is linked to what I'm currently looking at, I can access that and continue to work with it. And it's that interconnectivity which is really fabulous in all areas of MAXQDA. Okay, so on the left-hand side here, we've got all our codes by all our documents in a grid. Okay, but you've probably noticed that we've got, as well as the numbers telling us how many coded segments there are in each intersection between each row and each column, some of those have got this green background, and that green background is telling us that the data has been summarized already. You can see here I've got selected an intersection that doesn't have that green background. I can see those 4 coded segments, and I can see a space for a summary, but that summary hasn't been created yet. Whereas when I click on an intersection that does have a green background, then as well as seeing the coded segment, I see the summary that has been already been created. So basically what we have here is the ability to retrieve coded segments, document by document, code by code, okay, to see them, and then to create a summary. So that's meant to be a higher level analytic summary that you as the researcher is making about the coded segments that are sitting here, and it's related to the document level, so document by document. Okay, before I move on, I just want to show you that this is fairly overwhelming, isn't it? At the moment, we've got every single code by every single document. And those of you that have used MAXQDA before will know that the principle of activation is like a filter in MAXQDA. And what that allows us to do is to say, actually, I'm not interested in thinking about summarizing when I've got all of my data together. I want to focus my attention on particular subsets, particular areas of the data. So I'm just going to close that down and show you that if I decide, well, maybe I'm just interested in these codes, the work-life balance codes, I can activate just those codes. I can do that very quickly by clicking on the little tiny grey circle to the left of the code icon. That will activate them. I know they're activated because I've got the codes turning red, and also down at the bottom here in the status bar, it's telling me how many codes I've got activated. So that's one way to activate codes, or to take off that activation, to click there just to the left. You can also do it by right-clicking, right-click and activate, including the subcodes. I'm interested in the subcodes actually. In fact, if I don't want the top level, you can see there's nothing at the top level. It's just like a coat hanger in this example. I can just take that off and activate individual codes as I want. I could activate codes from various different areas in my coding schema. Anyway, I've decided that those are the ones I want to look at, and now I'm going to, in a similar fashion, decide actually I'm only interested in some of my data. Let's go for the interviews that are sitting in this particular document group, the Berlin document group. So again, I can right click to activate all the documents in that group. So now I've got 5 documents and 9 codes activated. And now when I go back to my summary grid, then I've got a much more focused table, which is somewhat less overwhelming. And you can see that here most of the intersections where there is coded data. Childcare for Matteo, there are no coded segments in that document for that code, and the same for all the ones that are empty. But let me just show you how to generate a summary. So here we are looking at the free time self-care code for Thanth, and I can just put my cursor in here and read what's going on here and make a summary. So I haven't got a huge amount of time to think deeply today, but I think what's going on here is individual free time activities, lots of different sporting etc, etc. I can write as much or as little as I want in here. Oops, I just pressed the wrong thing there. As much or as little as I want in here, and I've now created my summary, and that background has now gone green. So that's the process of creating summaries. You can see I find it quite useful to have the values, so I can see that some documents have got codes in them many more times than others, so I might start off with those. Anyway, let's pretend that I've done my summaries here of these data, focusing in on how each document, in this example, each document is an interview, so each document is one person's experiences or opinions. And now what I can do is abstract away from that level, having created those summaries, to view summary tables. So when I click on the Summary Tables button, which I can access from within the summary grid or indeed from the main analysis menu, here is one that has been created previously. And this is a summary of a particular code, typical workdays, across all interviews. Okay, so we've got a row for each interview, Riley, Matteo, Selim, etc., and one column for the code, typical workday. But what we're looking at here in this column is not the actual coded segments, but the summaries that have been created previously. And we've got a row for a few of the relevant document variables that the researcher wanted to see. So I'm just going to show you how to create one of those. I'm going to create a new summary table, and I'm going to choose those same codes that we were just looking at as the codes I want to focus on. I'm only going to do this for activated documents. I've still got my Berlin group of documents activated there, but I could do this across all documents if I wanted to. But I'm just going to choose the variables. So I have the choice of any document variables here. These have been created previously. I can have these document variables in their own column. That would mean I have one column for each separate document variable. What I'll actually do, though, is just remove those out and show you what happens if you put them in this top area here, which is actually, I'm interested in looking at them within one first column, just to show you the two different ways of working. So when I click OK, it creates for me that summary table. I can rename it here, so I can call it work-life balance. This is the Berlin documents. And you can see that I've got one row for each document and one column for each code that I asked for. So in the previous example, there was only one code column. This time I've got multiple code columns, and I'm able to see that there are summaries for typical workday for all of them, but not for other of the codes. But here you can see that the variables information this time is in the same first column, whereas if I go back to the previous one, which we were looking at, typical workdays, all interviews, I've got one separate column for each variable. So that's just a display option, whatever you prefer. So hopefully you can see how now what we're looking at is our summaries of the coded data, not the coded data themselves. There's various things that we can do up here. We can swap the rows and columns. So if you prefer to have the codes as the rows rather than the documents, then you can swap backwards and forwards. You can also highlight rows in the document color. Over here on the right hand side, 4 of these Berlin documents have been given the color yellow, and Riley has been given the color red. So if I highlight the rows in the document color, then we'll get to see that color. If you're new to MAXQDA, it's really well worth knowing that MAXQDA is really excellent at color. So color has a functional is functional in the software, and you get to see it in all kinds of different places. I can also export this in various ways. If I want to, I can export this summary table as a Word file, as an Excel file. So if I had a summary table that I wanted to import to include in a final report, then that might be an option that I do, and that happens very quickly, very easily. But I can also insert this summary table as a document in my main MAXQDA project. So if I then wanted to treat this view as data, then that would be an option that I could do. So let's just do that and see what happens. Click on there, and you may have seen in the background, let me just move these slightly out of the way so that you can see, I've now got a new document here, which is actually the summary table that I created, and that then can become data in its own right. So in that sense, you can really start that process of abstracting. Okay, so what have we looked at so far? We've looked at generating summary grids, which allows us to create our summaries, and then using the summary tables in order to look at our summaries and start to think about how they may allow us to analyze at that level of summarization. What I'd also like to show you is the Summary Explorer. So I'm just going to close these 2 windows down. I can come back to them at any point. The Summary Explorer allows me to make comparisons at every level. So what we saw previously with the summary tables was that I was making comparison of the summaries at the document level. And I can do that in the Summary Explorer as well. But what I can also do is make comparisons at higher levels. So another level of abstraction. So just to show you that, I'm going to reset my activations and then activate the codes I'm interested in. So just the work-life balance codes. And this time from the analysis menu, when I go to the Summary Explorer, then I'm going to bring in not the documents themselves, but I'm going to bring in the document groups. So I'm not interested in the individual documents within a group this time, like I was previously, but I want to look at the summaries that have been created for the work-life balance codes, which I'll access just by inserting the activated codes. I could have dragged and dropped them, but I'd activated them, so that's quick and easy. But now the focus is on those groups rather than the individual documents within the groups. So now when I click OK, I get another floating window that takes up my screen. At the moment, nothing appears to be here because I'm focused on the top level, that coat hanger code. And actually, of course, I want to have a look at the summaries which are happening at the code. So here I've chosen typical workday just because that's got the most summaries at it. There are 10 summaries. And now hopefully you can see that what I'm looking at here are the summaries of the code typical workday amongst any of the documents that are sitting in the Berlin document group, and able to compare those with the document group Hamburg. And those 2 document groups are based on where the interviewees in this project are living or were living at the time that they were interviewed. So hopefully you can then see that that's another level of abstraction, looking at those comparisons on the group level rather than the individual level. So each of those one by one abstracting, and we've got the same options here. I can export this as a Word document, as an Excel table, or export in a different format if I wanted to. So I'll just close that down and show you one more thing related to that. We've talked a little bit about the document variables, and previously in the summary tables we had on view in one column or multiple columns various variables, education, whether they're married, all that kind of thing. And in this project, what has been done previously is that sets have been created based on those variables. So I won't show you how to do that right now. You'll be able to get that information from another spotlight, I'm sure. But making use of those variables, we've gathered together shortcuts to documents here in these sets. So all of these are respondents who do not have children, and you can see that some of those are coming from the Berlin and some of them are coming from the Hamburg document group, and here we've got respondents who do have children. So what I can do in the Summary Explorer is to clear the list and not look at Berlin versus Hamburg, which was document groups, but this time look across those document groups, making use of the fact that we've created sets out of variables. So have a look at the same codes, but this time in relation to these sets. So I get a very similar thing here again, typical workday or domestic work or free time, self-care, whatever it is the code I'm interested in. But this time, focusing on the set level, I'm able to make comparisons of the summaries on the group rather than the individual level. And that's what's enabled for us using the Summary Explorer, looking at groups as well as individual documents. So basically we create the summaries in the summary grid. We look at them in relation to individual documents in the summary tables, and then we can explore them in relation to groups, making use of documents, sets, and by proxy variables in that way. Okay, so those are the three main levels of abstraction. I'm just going to finish off just by reminding you, let me just reset my activations. Again, always a good idea if you're new to MAXQDA to reset your activations of codes and documents before you do the next thing, just to make sure you haven't got an old activation hanging over that may skew what you're seeing. And I can ask to have an overview at various different levels. So we were looking at, who were we looking at before? Matteo, maybe. If I right click on a document, I can ask to get an overview of the summaries that are related to that one document. And again, that comes up in a little floating window. And these are all the summaries that relate to this one document, Matteo. And it's showing me here the codes. And if I choose each one, then in the panel above, I get the summary that was created. I can sort this by code so that I get all of the codes together. So that's one way that I can focus in, okay, what are the summaries that I created on one document? I can do the same thing on a higher level. So I can right click on the Berlin document group and choose the summaries. And these are all the summaries that have been created for any of the documents that sit in that document group. So not just Matteo, but all of the other documents that sit there. So that's really very useful. And of course, if I right click on a set, I can do that here as well. So these are all of the summaries that have been created from anybody who is not currently having children, so respondents without children. And I can do something similar at the code level. In this example, we've been focusing our attention mainly on this small group of codes here, the work-life balance code. There's no segments at that top level. Remember, that's the coat hanger code, as I would call it. So there's no point in asking for the summaries there, because there won't be anything there, because there's no coded segments. Remember that summaries are linked to coded segments. You have to have coded first. But if I go to an individual code and right click, then I can access the summaries related to that particular code. And you'll see here in that example, there's actually only one from education, and that's in Mateo. So the point really is that, well, the general point about this, let's flick back here. Oops. Is that summaries, a summary of summaries. Summaries are very, very useful, very cool tool. I find them useful for all kinds of different reasons. There's loads of potential for using summaries for methodological and practical reasons. But hopefully that kind of discussion today, looking at the different stages at which you create those different tools, the summary grids, the summary tables, the summary explorer, helps you to see the potential that you might put to summaries in your own project. Okay, so I've come to the end of my half hour of demonstration and discussion, so happy to take any questions that there might be in the Q&A. So I'll just have a quick look at that. Okay, so I often use summaries for a literature review. When I transfer summaries to a paper, I export them as Excel and insert them into the paper. When afterwards I made new summaries, here is my question. Okay, so before I look at the question, I absolutely use summaries for literature reviews as well. So Hiroyuki, thank you for bringing that up. I think it's really useful to broadly code literature to different themes or concepts or methods or whatever it is that you're coding in the literature, and then summarize. And being able to export that is a really nice way of generating like what sometimes is called a sort of evidence extraction table. So that's great to hear. So the question, when afterwards I made new summaries, here's my question. Do you have any idea to record to distinguish between the summaries which I already put into the paper and those which I didn't or are new? Okay, that's an interesting question. So I think the question is to do with appending summaries. So having initially created some and then going back and looking at the literature again in another kind of wave of reading. Within the summaries themselves, I think the way that I would probably do that would be to use caps or not on my keyboard to distinguish the different levels. But yes, that's a really interesting thing to be able to see that, or to put in this. If you didn't want to do it that way, you could put a sort of date or time stamp in between the earlier summary and the later summary, so that you could see the progression by time of those thoughts that you're having. Hopefully that's a helpful response. Let me know if not, Hiroyuki. Okay, Carolina, in a summary grid, I have a lot of columns and only a few rows. Can I rearrange the grid in such a way that rows represent documents and codes are in columns? So let's come back to MAXQDA. So in the summary grid, the question is, let's bring this up. So I'm not activated to anything at the moment. No, in the summary grid, you can't transpose the columns to the rows. I think that's what you're asking for, Carolina. You can do that in the summary table. So when I'm in a summary table, I can swap the rows to the columns. But in the summary grid, which is the window that you're in when you're actually creating the summaries by choosing an area and then summarizing, it's going to display the codes in the rows and the documents in the columns. So the best way, I think, to focus what you're seeing is through that process of activation. So activating the codes that you're interested in and maybe working through, let's go for Hangberg this time, working through documents according to groups, or you can just, if you've only got one group of documents, then you could just choose the first few and bring them up just so that that table is a bit more manageable. But here in the summary grid, you can't at the moment transpose the rows into the columns, but you can when you're in the summary tables. Okay, so Olivia asks a really interesting question about colours of code. So I showed you, I think that comes from the discussion of being in the summary tables and highlighting the rows in the document colour. So you can also, let me just close this down, you can also change the colour of code. So the work-life balance codes are all blue at the moment, but we were looking at typical workday, weren't we? If I right click and change that from blue to, let's go for this turquoisey color. When I'm back in the summary grid, then I get to see that here, but I can't see that in any other place. So I don't have the ability to display that color here. And equally at the moment in the summary tables, the highlight is based on the document color, not the code color. It might be that comes in the future if you wanted to see code color, then that would make a column a particular color based on the code. But at the moment, that's not happening. You only see the code color associated with the code label over here, and actually you don't see that in the column header here. Do you? If you swap the rows, yeah, you don't see that anywhere in the summary tables at the moment. So that's a good point. Maybe something to feed back to the MAXQDA developers, Olivier. Victoria was going to ask a question, but I think I've answered it already. Bill, let's say you have made summaries and maybe maps in MAXQDA and your ideas have started to come together and you want to discuss your formative ideas with colleagues. Would you work within MAXQDA to walk through your emerging ideas interactively in a meeting with colleagues? Or would you export to Word or PPT, etc.? Okay, I think that's a really excellent question, Bill. And I think your qualification at the end of your question is maybe the crux of the answer, isn't it? It seems if you're really good with MAXQDA, you might be able to work within MAXQDA and be quite efficient in the said meeting. Yeah, I think if you, it's not just about your own familiarity and confidence with showing others what you've done in MAXQDA. It's also their familiarity with understanding what you've done by looking at it through the interface that is the MAXQDA software. So I think those two things would affect whether I would show the workings through MAXQDA or via exports. I think it depends on who you're speaking to as well. So, and the forum within which you're illustrating your point, Bill. So if it was a research team, so if it was colleagues who were involved in the research project, but there were some who just weren't using MAXQDA, then I may well want to show them in MAXQDA in order to be able to show the interconnectivity between everything. If it was a conference presentation or some other kind of output in that sense, then it might be they're exporting different aspects, different visualizations. There's all kinds of charts and other visualizations, including maps that you mentioned, that you can generate to capture the analysis, and that they can always be very easily exported. So that can be really powerful. But I have done a conference presentation a few years ago when I was speaking to an audience that was primarily quantitative, and I wanted to share with them the results of a very qualitative project that we'd done. And I decided that actually showing the software would be a very powerful way of communicating to an audience who may be a little bit skeptical about the value of qualitative analysis. And I created a backup of the whole project, and then removed out of it things I wasn't going to focus on. And then I did my conference presentation through the software rather than in a traditional PowerPoint way. And I think being able to show kind of maps and other visualizations, the results of interrogations, frequency of codes and all that kind of thing. And you might be aware that you can get various statistics and various things. Being able to show those kinds of visualizations in ways that a quantitative audience could understand, but then be able to drill down from there back to the data that substantiates, that sits behind those findings. I found that to be a very powerful way of convincing a skeptical and otherwise skeptical audience that actually qualitative research is rigorous, it is systematic, and that the software allows you to illustrate that. And I find that to be quite a powerful use of MAXQDA. So that's something to think about. Hopefully that answers your question. Victoria's got a question about, can you only create summaries by documents? Yeah, at the moment that's the case. I'm really hoping that in the future I can choose the focus of the summaries. So look out, maybe that will come in the future. But at the moment, in the way that I demonstrated it, Victoria, that's the way that it works. Okay, I think, are there new questions? The content from summaries only comes from memos, or can we generate summaries from tables only? No, Olivier, the summaries come from the codes and the documents, not the memos. So it's somewhat confusing maybe, but if I go to a memo, actually, let's do it on a code memo. So if I open up a memo, so here's a memo on the code education, which is like a little sticky note. You do have in the memo area, you do have this code summary space that you can make use of, but that's a different function from what I've been talking about in the summaries, because this code summary is about the code itself. So it's not really directly linked to the coded segments that it may be about, in the same way that it would be if you were using the summary grid functionality in the way that I described. So I think your second point there is actually the correct thing. So we generate summary grids as tables, which are codes by documents, basically. So you might do a similar analytic thing here in the memo, within a memo, but it's not linked back to the data in the same way, and it's not displayed in a tabular form. So it's that tabular form and the link back, the interconnectivity back, which makes it slightly different. Okay, I'm starting to lose the trail of the comments slightly. Okay, so Anna Katerina is asking the question about variables. You have interview data and would like to combine it with the characteristics of people. Okay, very quickly, I'll just show you variables again, seeing as I illustrated them in the summaries. So here we've got some interviews and their individual interview transcripts. Let me just reset my activations. If I go to my variables, I can bring up a list of variables. And you've got three different types of variables. The red ones are system variables that MAXQDA creates itself. But these blue ones, these are the ones that you might create, Anna Katrina, to indicate a factual characteristic about somebody. So what their age is, whether they've got children or not. So you create variables in here, document variables. So let's just create a variable called happy. And maybe the values are yes or no. Are you happy? Yes or no? Let's hope that most people are happy. Click OK. There's my new variable. And then when I click to the data editor for document variables, Then all the way over here, I have a column that's happy, yes, no. And right now I'm just going to make it up. Let's say this person is not happy. This person is yes, happy, etc., etc. And hopefully you can see that here you have variables for employment, whether they're employed, self-employed, retired, etc., and various other things. So that's basically the process. If you need more step by step, I'd go to the help menu. The help menu is really excellent, but hopefully that's useful. Fabulous. So Olivia, if you're not seeing any content, does that mean you're not seeing any content in the grid itself or something else? So if I just take off all my activations, I'm in the sample project. I don't know whether you're in your own project when you're trying this out, but the summary grid, you won't have any green initially if you're in your own project, but you'll have these blue squares or circles or indeed numbers, values, if you've changed it to values, and that's telling you how many coded segments there are for each code in each document. So if you're in your own project, you'd have these numbers, and then you'd go to one of them and you would read the coded segments for that document and that code. So here I'm on the all of the segments that have been coded to the education code in the document, which is Chris's interview, and I'd read those 4 segments and then I'd summarize those. So the idea is that you're making a higher level conceptual abstracted summary of these 4 coded segments so that you can go to that higher data reduction level, if that makes sense. So I'm not completely sure what it was that you weren't seeing, but at the basic level, you should definitely see values, squares or circles. You won't see the green unless you've actually started to enter the summaries yourselves. Okay, so we're coming to the end. I may well have missed a couple of questions, and I apologize if that's the case, but let me just bring up. In fact, what I'll do is in the chat, I'll just put my email address. Just check I've written it out right. Yeah. So there's my email address. If anybody wants to get in touch and ask any follow-up questions, if I missed your question, I apologize. Please email me with your question. I'll be happy to respond by email. And hopefully see some of you elsewhere in the conference later on today or indeed tomorrow. I've got a session on literature reviewing coming up later on this afternoon. Maybe see some of you there.